That means my first time at U of T, and I've really been enjoying the past few days. So it's a very nice opportunity to speak to you, and thanks to all of you for coming. My talk has two titles: Judeo Arabic Literature 101 and Toledot Yeshu, The Life of Jesus. I am aware of how wonderfully varied this audience is, and for that reason, as every lecturer should and must do, I'm hoping to be speaking to every single one of you. For those of you with some knowledge of Judeo Arabic and the highly important treasures preserved in it, I hope to enrich you with current research of formerly unknown texts. And for those of you with less awareness of the importance of the Jewish sources preserved in Arabic, I hope to give you a window into a period about which you might know less, and to surprise you with an introduction to an important work from this period. And finally, of course, as I always hope to do, to inspire you to learn more. So I want to talk today about a scandalous polemic written against Christianity. It was written at some point in late antiquity. It was written by Jews, although it was anonymous. This was not the first time that Jews were writing against Christianity. We have scattered bits and pieces throughout rabbinic literature. But this was the first coherent and independent composition that Jews wrote against Christianity. What was this? It was a narrative, a story of the life of Jesus, an anti-gospel, by which I mean an inversion of the story of the last days and crucifixion of Jesus. This was a mocking of fundamental Christian beliefs, and it came to be known by the almost biblical phrase, Toledot Yeshu, the life of Jesus. This work was well attested in Europe. Manuscript evidence from France and Spain shows that it was known by the late medieval period in Europe. Some 70 to 80 manuscripts in Hebrew, Yiddish, Latin. The manuscript circulated in secret among Jews. So here you have, and in public by Christians, such as the Christian Hebraist, a professor of Oriental languages, whose name was Johannes Christoph Wagenseil in the 17th century. So he published it along with other anti-Christian tracts in order to show people what Jews were saying about Christianity in secret places. These European manuscripts are for the most part quite late, the 17th century or later. I said 70 to 80 manuscripts in Europe. Now, this is perhaps the significant number that we would expect in Christian Europe with its at times harsh anti-Jewish environment and pressures to convert to Christianity. My talk today will illuminate the little-known history of Toledot Yeshu in medieval Arabic-speaking lands that were governed by Muslims. And we're going to investigate the startling fact that this anti-Christian parody is nearly as well attested in Near Eastern Jewish communities as it was for their European counterparts. So working in the Cairo Genizah and the Russian Firkovich manuscript collections, I've identified some 24 manuscripts of Toledot Yeshu that survived from the Near East during the time periods known to scholars of the Near East as the Fatimid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman periods. That is from the 11th to the 17th centuries. So we're talking about two quite large collections of Judeo Arabic manuscripts. The Cairo Genizah, a trove from the Rabbinite synagogue in Fustat, mostly consisting of relatively small fragments that had gotten old and passed out of use. So this is an iconic picture of Solomon Schechter that many of you might be familiar with, completely staged, but all 19th century photographs were completely staged. But in any case, a very famous picture of him with the manuscripts from the Cairo Genizah. The Firkovich collection is also a fascinating story. It was a collection created by a Karaite community leader from the Crimea, which he put together in the mid to late 19th century with the funding of the Russian government. So we're talking about some 15,000 items, many of them 200 to 300 folios. This is Judeo Arabic, and some Hebrew material that is far from fully explored. I do a lot of work in this collection, and if you have more questions, we can definitely talk about it in the Q&A. These texts are in Judeo Arabic, which is the particular kind of Arabic written by Near Eastern Jews. So this is what Judeo Arabic looks like. This is one of the manuscripts that I work with. You can see this one is in Hebrew characters. So just a few words about Judeo Arabic to make sure we're all on the same page. Following the Islamic conquest of the Near East and the Mediterranean during the 7th century, the Arabic language had spread, and it had to a large extent replaced the earlier lingua franca in the region, which was Aramaic. And Jews, many Jews, were now native speakers and users of Arabic. How many Jews? About 90% of the world's Jewish population at this point, and you see that this map has to do with around the year 900. About 90% were native Arabic speakers, and this would remain the case for some centuries, until about the 12th or 13th century. This meant that once Jews began to write, and I mean to take quill to paper, and also to take up the idea of individual and original authorship, to say, I'm the one writing this composition, it's a new composition, it's not tradition that I'm passing on necessarily, it's my new thing. Once Jews began to do this in the 9th century, they did so in Arabic. We call this language Judeo Arabic, and these changes, the beginning of individual authorship and the adoption of Judeo Arabic for writing, were a very significant change that impacted what we call Jewish scholarship until today. Why is this language called by a different name? Why is it Judeo Arabic and not just Arabic? Why am I calling it a special name? So one is script, and you saw in the manuscript that I put up that it was in Hebrew script. Judeo Arabic was sometimes written in Hebrew letters. This would become more and more the case after the 10th century. Prior to the 10th century, we might see Judeo Arabic in Arabic letters, and I would still call it Judeo Arabic. So beyond the issue of script, we have other differences between Judeo Arabic and Arabic as written by Muslims. One is what we call syntax and morphology, the way it's written. So Jews writing in Arabic did not strictly observe the norms of written Arabic. That is to say, this is still Arabic, but it's not Arabic. It's a little bit different than Muslim written Arabic. And keep in mind, I'm talking about written Arabic here. Why is this? Because Arabic is a language that has what we call diglossia. Diglossia means that Arabic exists in sort of two fashions. Written Arabic is a very different thing than spoken Arabic. And this relates to theology, to questions of the holy status of Arabic as the language of the Quran. Jews, and Christians also, by the way, did not subscribe to these theological tenets. So this meant that their written Arabic was less formal. It didn't mean that they wrote and spoke exactly the same way, because Jews as Arabic speakers definitely believed that language should be spoken and written in two different ways. But we must note that they weren't as super careful about the grammatical norms as Muslims would have been. And then the third feature that is very special about Judeo Arabic is that an author writing in Judeo Arabic would use words and terms in Hebrew and Aramaic. So these are sort of three major features of Judeo Arabic. Now, the important thing is, as I noted, this created a sea change in what Jews were writing, and it shaped the next 300 years of Jewish composition. So we're talking, like I said, from about the year 900 to the 12th or 13th century. Now, why was this? Why is the adoption of Arabic for writing so important? I mean, Jews have used a lot of languages, right? So this was because Arabic at the time was the language of intellectual culture. This was the time in which the Near Eastern inheritance of Greek, Syriac, Pahlavi, which is Middle Persian, Sanskrit, all of these materials were being translated or transferred in some way into Arabic. So Jews had access to all of this because they were native Arabic speakers and readers. The second reason is that Arabic was not only the intellectual language of the time, it was also the spoken language of all. So this means that arguably, for the first time in Jewish history, until the modern period, Jews were speaking the language that was also the language of intellectual inquiry and was also the language that everybody else was speaking and writing in. So this meant that there were few barriers between adherents of different religions, and everybody was reading things that the others had to say. So the adoption of Arabic for writing brought on a whole host of new genres and new approaches. So here what you have is just an example of one of those. It's a Bible commentary from the 10th century. And those of you who can read a bit of Judeo Arabic can note features of, I'm writing this backwards, can note features of, did I just do that? Oh no. Help. I think I did that. Okay, sorry. I pushed something wrong. You can note signs of any of you who know any Arabic, and if you know Hebrew script, you can follow along with me. So this author, 10th century author, we don't have to talk about him, although he's very interesting. إني بعد أن فرغت من تأليف هذا الكتاب في معاني التوراة التي هي غير الفرائض تأملت ما عملته في تفسير blah blah blah. I'll translate. So he says, so first of all, note the authorial I, after I finished writing the book about the meanings of the Bible, the narrative sections, I looked at what I had done and I found that it was blah, blah, blah. And basically what he says is he thinks he went on too long about the theological and philosophical meanings and he needed to create something shorter. So we can see, first of all, the author is here. We can see, second of all, there's philosophy in the Bible. There's theology in the Bible. These people are writing about new things that earlier Bible commentary, the Midrashim or things we might find in the Talmud, we're not including. So this is just one example. For you, we could talk about this at length. We could do a whole course about this. So now that you know what Judeo Arabic is and have a sense of its importance as the language and the reading language of 90% of the world's population during the time we're discussing, I want to focus in on the work that we want to talk about today. A different kind of work in Judeo Arabic, a polemical work. That means a work that Jews wrote against another religion, in this case against Christianity. Polemics, by the way, are works written against other religions, were a very common and widespread genre in Arabic-speaking lands. So Muslims, Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, a lot of people were writing polemics against the religion of the other. Toledot Yeshu, a parody of the life of Jesus, was one of a number of works that Jews wrote against Christianity during this period. And what I want to do with the remainder of the time I have is to explore with you ways to understand Toledot Yeshu's extraordinarily strong attestation in the medieval Islamic realms. Why was Toledot Yeshu so popular among Near Eastern Jews? Why would Jews who lived in Islamic lands with free practice of their own religion, as Ahl al-Kitab, Ahl al-Dhimma, people of the book, with no pressure to convert to Christianity or Islam, why would they be so interested in reading and transmitting this parody of the life of Jesus? Now, it's not only that we could question the need for this polemical work. This act would actually have been even worse. It would have been dangerous and offensive, and this work would have offended Muslims as well as Christians. So, wrong way. So Jesus is a revered prophet in the Quran. What I'm showing you here is what's known as the tree of the prophets, Shajarat al-Anbiya, well-known decoration that you could find in a lot of Muslim homes. So you'll see that Jesus is right up there with many other prophets. I've circled Jesus. And this is based on the Quran, where Jesus, I'm quoting here from Surah Miriam, which is Surah 19 in the Quran. One of the miracles of Jesus in the Quran is that he speaks from the cradle. He's born and he speaks right away. This is one of the miracles of Jesus. I could give a whole lecture on these verses, which are fascinating and are not easy. This miracle is not easy to find in Christian sources. But suffice it to say that look at what Jesus is attributed in the Quran. He's given the scripture and he's a prophet and he's blessed wherever he may be. So Muslims would not have taken well to insults about Jesus either. Note that I have no evidence that Muslims knew about Toledot Yeshu, and you can ask me more about that in the questions if you want. So what I'm going to suggest is that the answer to this conundrum that I'm posing to you of why Toledot Yeshu was so well attested among the Jews of the Near East lies in its multivalence in the medieval Near East. That is, in the varied and different functions that this narrative served. And these functions are revealed by consideration of the Judeo Arabic manuscripts I've identified in their cultural, theological, and historical context. So I'll begin with a very brief introduction to the contents of Toledot Yeshu, and then we'll move forward to answering the question that I've posed about Toledot Yeshu in Judeo Arabic. So envision with me an Aramaic composition parodying Jesus' last days and crucifixion has been written and is circulating orally and perhaps also on papyrus. This work is the first that we know of Toledot Yeshu, and I'm going to call it the short version. This short version survived in very fragmentary form, in a few Aramaic and Hebrew fragments, as well as some Judeo Arabic fragments. You can imagine this was pretty logical, a response to the pressures of Byzantine Christian rule and to Christian polemic. It begins to circulate. So this is a 9th or 10th century manuscript in Cambridge. It's the absolute earliest attestation that we have of Toledot Yeshu. Now, the exact timing of this composition is debated. Some scholars date it to the 2nd century CE, as early as that. Some say, no, it must be just at the end of late antiquity before sort of the Islamic period takes off and Arabic takes over. But anyway, the language of these early versions is Aramaic. It's composed of bits and pieces from rabbinic tradition. So you can identify, if somebody who knows how Jesus appears in the Talmud can identify little bits and pieces in this short narrative. So what's the result? The first freestanding polemic against Christianity written by Jews. So what were the contents of this thing? So it begins with a trial. Yeshu Yochanan, who's John the Baptist, and the disciples are in trial. This is a well-known section as well from the Talmud and Sanhedrin. They become known as magicians, and this is a classic polemic against Jesus from antiquity. I mean, we find this in pagan texts, that Jesus' powers are far from divine, they're simply everyday magic. Then they do an attempted magic trick where Caesar's daughter, Caesar is a figure in this narrative, where Caesar's daughter becomes pregnant. This is likely an inversion on the miracle of Jesus' conception as recounted in Luke and Matthew. The trick fails. Caesar's daughter dies. Yeshu and Yochanan are hanged. And of course, this is probably one of the major points of this narrative, a parodical retelling of Jesus' ascension as recounted in the Gospels. You know, he's not there, so why is his body not in the grave? This is the most basic version of Toledot Yeshu. But after these beginnings, something very interesting happens. And this becomes apparent in manuscripts surviving from around the 11th century in Judeo Arabic. So by the 11th century, two clearly distinguished versions of Toledot Yeshu are in evidence. This original short parody that I presented to you. And then there's a longer version that traces a much longer path from Jesus' birth to his conception, that's very important, to his childhood, to his crucifixion, to an after history of Christianity. So let me set out for you the contents of this even more shocking composition, and I'm going to illustrate it with translations from the Judeo Arabic manuscripts that I've identified. So the conception, a parody on the virgin birth and the idea of Jesus as the Son of God. Jesus has a mother whose name is Miriam in this text. He has a supposed father who in this text, his name is Yochanan. The father goes out, the neighbor comes in, the neighbor does what he does, and that's the quote I'm showing you. This is obviously an act of adultery. It's even worse because Miriam is in the period of nida, of menstruation. Yochanan comes back and is confronted by Miriam. And this is a scene that acquires great elaboration as the narrative develops. So then childhood and study, and we can see here familiar themes that are in some ways familiar from Christian tradition, the infancy gospels of Jesus as this amazing child, this wunderkind he's smarter than everybody, and he's chutzpahdik, he's smart and he's chutzpahdik. So this develops themes that we see in other descriptions of Jesus. And then Jesus behaves questionably towards authority figures. So this is a classic description in all of the versions of Toledot Yeshu. He behaves very rudely to the sages. He's the enfant terrible, you know, he's really a terrible behavior. So the rabbis begin to ask, well, wait a minute, if this guy is behaving so badly, there must be something that should be discovered about his past. So they call his mother in for questioning. And you can imagine this poor woman standing before the rabbis. This scene, by the way, is very much elaborated in different versions of Toledot Yeshu. So they call her in for questioning, and she sort of explains that she had no idea what was going on. And then once Yeshu, by the way, obviously Toledot Yeshu, so he's called Yeshu in this text, not Jesus, right? That was clear. So I'll start calling him maybe Yeshu. So Yeshu becomes a renegade. He steals the name, and his use of the ineffable name of God is a very central feature of Toledot Yeshu. So again, we see the trope of the magician. He's accomplishing his deeds by this sort of misuse of the ineffable name of God. So you can see in the quote, he's betrayed by one of his followers, as in the gospel. There's a chase story. I mean, it's a great action narrative. So he's betrayed, he's caught, executed, and buried. And then Toledot Yeshu presents the later history of the Christian religion, presents sort of the Jewish version of the parting of the ways, which of course happened because the Jews planted a sort of counter agent who was going to act as if he was a Christian, but he was going to convince the Christians to leave the Jewish religion. So that's the plot of Toledot Yeshu. This long version of Toledot Yeshu, with its action scenes, with its bed trick and its conception scenes, all of the excitement, eventually prevailed. That is, we do not find the short version attested, or hardly find it, following the 13th century. So only a few specific contexts where the short version survives. The long version completely takes over. This is the majority of the manuscripts. Now, the relation between these two, the short and the long version, is disputed among researchers of Toledot Yeshu. So how and when did this long version develop? I mean, can we envision we had this short version and then, over time the long version develops? Or, as some scholars believe, was it a side-by-side, sort of parallel development? Why does the short version die out by the 13th century, and it's not copied anymore, in favor of the long version? And how did it survive to be quoted in a few fascinating late Hebrew texts? So I believe that we can answer this question regarding Toledot Yeshu by a careful examination of the Judeo Arabic manuscripts. And furthermore, we're also going to get back to the question that I framed this lecture with: why were the Jews of the Near East so interested, apparently so interested, in this work? So I believe that a variety of types of evidence point to the idea that this long and expanded version, parodical, humorous, salacious, however you want to describe it, this long version of Toledot Yeshu was composed by Arabic-speaking Jews living in the early Islamic period, specifically at some point during the classical Abbasid period. So what do I mean by the Abbasid period? So we talked before, we started with the Fatimid period, so now I'm taking it back a little bit further to the Abbasid period, so from about 750 to 1000. Now remember, we're talking about the 8th or 9th century. Arabic and Islam have been spreading in the region for more than 2 centuries. This is a high period of classical scholarship in Arabic, translations from Greek, Syriac, a real time of great learning, a vibrant period for scholars of all faiths. Let me explain why I think that this period was such a fertile atmosphere for the creation of this long version of Toledot Yeshu, for this development of Toledot Yeshu. So there are 3 historical and literary circumstances that lead me to this suggestion. So first is the textual evidence, and for this we're going to start to look at the source sheets I've given you. So as I've noted, among the earliest manuscripts of Toledot Yeshu are some 11th century Judeo-Arabic renditions. So you can see here one of the manuscripts that I work with. This is from the Elkan Natan Adler collection at the Jewish Theological Society of America. The section of the plot that's represented in this beautiful fragment is where the rabbis have begun to suspect Yeshu, and they call his mother in, Miriam, to query her about his birth. So this is the place where the rabbi recounts what happened 30 years ago when Miriam's husband came to say, oh my gosh, something happened last night, and I'm not exactly sure what it was. So the rabbi has this memory from 30 years ago. So it's a very complex literary structure. It's a tale within a tale within a tale. So this particular manuscript is from the 11th or 12th century. It's one of the earliest fragments that I found. And I've brought you in source number 1, I've brought you that manuscript, which is A, and I've brought you B, which is a parallel, which is also from an early 11th or 12th century fragments. And what I want you to note, and I'm going to read to you a bit from these manuscripts, is how differently these two fragments present the same plot element. Okay, so you can first look at source 1. I'll read it in Arabic. You can follow along in English. So فأجاب شمعون, and there's a lot of gaps in this. 30 سنة جاء إلى عندي يوحنان وقال blah 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 له مع زوجته وإنه راد. Anyway, you see that the rabbi is going here into a full-blown description of what happened. He answered, 30 years ago this husband came and he said this and he said that. Now if you look at the manuscript B, you see that this whole description is presented in 2 words. He told me his tale. وَحَدَّثَنِي حَدِيثَهُ. That's it. He told me his tale. We don't have the whole repetition. So it's not a difference in words. It's not just a difference in construction. You know, it's a whole abbreviation of this section of the story. And by the way, the Arabic transliteration you have, that is my transliteration, but obviously the manuscript is in Hebrew characters. So if by the 11th and 12th century there are versions that are pretty different, and likely oral versions that exhibit even more differences, this is a hint to us that the narrative has had time to develop and circulate. The 11th and 12th century is not the beginning of this narrative, and this is part of the long narrative. This is part of a very long Toledot Yeshu version. We can strengthen this suggestion by examination of other literary creations in the period. So if we look at 10th century liturgical poetry, piyut, it has literary references to what sounds like Toledot Yeshu. So specifically, a Jewish poet writing in Egypt named Yosef ibn Abitur refers to Yeshu, to Jesus, in a liturgical poem, which is a polemical anti-Christian work, as Mamzer ben Nida. Okay, Mamzer ben Nida, this is from the 10th century. This epithet is strongly associated with the Toledot Yeshu story. To the best of my knowledge, it's first attested in the long version of Toledot Yeshu. So if a 10th century poet is using this epithet when he wants to disparage Jesus, it's likely that other themes in this poem, by the way, also point to knowledge of Toledot Yeshu. So it seems that people in Egypt know about the Toledot Yeshu narrative. The second reason that it seems to me that we can point to the early Islamic period as when this second long version of Toledot Yeshu developed relates to interreligious polemic as evidenced in surviving literature. So the early Islamic period was marked by acerbic Jewish-Christian polemic. So we should not envision that Islam comes and everybody starts polemicizing against Islam. No, Jews and Christians continued to write against the other religion. Christian polemic in particular was quite vocal during this period, and we have a huge number of sources preserved from the 7th and 8th century in Greek and Syriac, much of it written in the Levant. Arabic anti-Jewish polemics by Christians are also well attested during this period. It is increasingly clear that Jews are a real target in these texts, not a literary fiction. And I submit that Jews would have responded to these attacks. In general, the field of polemic in Judeo Arabic is a fascinating one. I'm just touching on it briefly, but I'm happy to talk about it more after. So we have 4 attested anti-Christian polemical works by Jews that date to the 9th century, and that's not including Toledot Yeshu. 3 are by a very interesting figure named Dawood al-Muqammas, who was from a place called Raqqa, which is in a place that we call the Jazeera, sort of today's, if you think of the triangle between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey of today. 3 were by him. The 4th is an anonymous work which made it big in Europe, which is known as the story of the disputation of the priest, Qissat Mujadalat al-Uskuf, and exists in Hebrew under the name Nestor HaKomer, and it was very, very well known in Europe. So this was a hodgepodge of anti-Christian arguments. The tone of 3 out of 4 of these works was aggressive, confrontational, insulting. And these were very different than the kind of works we would find just 1 century later in the 10th century in Judeo Arabic, when we get to very rational polemics against the opposite faith. So in the 9th century, we find very aggressive tones. An expanded version of Toledot Yeshu that is this rude inversion of Jesus's birth and more, fits very well into this aggressive and rough literary tone of the polemics we find composed in the early Islamic period. Now, the third and final element that I want to suggest was the reason that Jews might have been motivated to create an expanded version of Toledot Yeshu during this early Arabic period, relates to another literary genre that was widespread in this period. And this is biographies of Jesus. They're known as infancy gospels, a very well-known genre in the Near East. It's a genre that began as early as the 2nd century. Some of you might be familiar with a work called the Protoevangelium of James. These works fill in the details of Jesus's childhood, which are very limited in the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't tell us much at all about Jesus as a child, and especially, for example, his time in Egypt. You would want to hear about that. So these works fill that in. Jesus' miracles as a child. There's a strikingly wide array of works devoted to this topic, to talking about Jesus's youth and the amazing things he did in his youth. They're widespread in a variety of Near Eastern languages, and most importantly, they're very well attested in Arabic. So Jews of this period would have been familiar with these texts. They would have been familiar with these Christian texts. Even more so, they would have been familiar with the way they appeared in Muslim texts, because the Quran has a lot of stories about Jesus, the Hadith, the Muslim oral literature, works of history, prophet stories. You would have been surrounded by stories of Jesus if you were reading pretty much anything in Arabic. So it stands to reason that Jews might have composed a parody, which would have been entertaining to them and which would have fulfilled a polemical purpose. And we might even call this a Jewish infancy gospel, which would hint at its creator's familiarity with key elements of Christian and Muslim narratives, and which would be a cathartic inversion of aspects of them, very humorous to a Jewish audience. This would have been part of an at least three-way conversation that was going on about Jesus in Arabic. So anyway, these three aspects that I've talked about, the textual evidence, the polemical environment, and the existence of a genre that treated Jesus's early childhood, hint that the texts that I see attested in the 11th century could have taken shape during that period. So this literary creation, the long version of Toledot Yeshu, would have served a very important polemical purpose for the Jews of the very religiously variegated developing Muslim world. Then the Near East underwent transformations, and with it, the Jewish communities and their approach to their literary creations, including Toledot Yeshu. The acerbic nature of Judeo-Christian interactions that characterized the early Islamic period faded, but Toledot Yeshu, the parodical narrative with a polemical bent, remained relevant. Why? Again, the Judeo Arabic manuscript record elucidates the reason. So here I want to talk about the later manuscripts I found. Many of the manuscripts, I showed you 11th and 12th century manuscripts, but many of my manuscripts are from a later period, from the 14th, 15th, 16th century. And one asks why? Why did this text remain relevant? So the Judeo Arabic manuscript record, and I mean the some 24 manuscripts that I've identified, which cover about 600 years, from the 11th century till about the 17th century, clearly reflect a transition towards function as a popular narrative. So we're going to see this on the level of language, the way the Arabic of the manuscripts is written, and we're also going to see style, stylistic usages and humor that are characteristic of popular literature. And finally, I'm going to show you the literary context in which Toledot Yeshu circulates. So let's have a look at the details. And here, what I mentioned earlier about what we call register in Judeo-Arabic. So is Judeo-Arabic written in a more formal or an informal way? And I said to you that Jews who were speaking Arabic still believed that you should not write and speak exactly the same way. There was a difference. But this difference, the gap between how you write and how you speak, begins to narrow later on. And that's what we're going to talk about. So the earliest manuscripts that I found of Toledot Yeshu reflect a very classical Judeo-Arabic style. So this one, RNL, means Russian National Library. So it's from the Firkovich collection. The plot section here is the resurrection of Jesus. That is addressing the question, why is Jesus' body not in the grave? So the followers of Yeshu are telling the queen, he's raised up to God. But the real reason is pretty prosaic in the narrative, obviously. One of the Jews removed his body from the grave. So please have a look at source 2 on page 2 on your handout. I'm going to read a little bit in Arabic for those of you who know Arabic to sort of get the classical flavor of this text, and the rest in English. So it starts out, يا مولاتنا هذا الذي قتلوه اليهود هو المسيح تأملي كم من الآيات والعجوبات أظهر في حياته والآن بعد مماته دفنوه وليس هو في قبره بل أنه طلع السماء. Okay, so they're explaining to her that Jesus he went up to heaven. These are the supporters of Yeshu speaking. He went up to heaven. That's why he's not in the grave. Look at all of these things he's done. So the style of this Arabic is very high register. The demonstrative pronouns like hava, dhalika, forms of negation are those of written Arabic, not those of spoken Arabic. Lam ya'rifu, particles that exist only in classical written Arabic, laysa. All of these things mark this text as a text in very formal Arabic. So this is high register Judeo Arabic, probably the highest register we're likely to find in the kind of manuscripts that I deal with. From the 13th century on, it is fascinating to see that the majority of the Toledot Yeshu manuscripts are composed in a very popular form of Judeo Arabic, low register Judeo Arabic. So it sounds very, very different from this manuscript in source 2. The form in which the words are written is quite different from the form of classical Arabic. And furthermore, there's a lot of dialectal speech. You know, it really sounds like something you could hear spoken on the street. And it's quite different than the way Arabic and even Judeo Arabic are normally written. Specifically, it's an Egyptian dialect. So for any of you who have spent time in Egypt, you're going to enjoy the next section. So if you look at source 3, so I'm reading to you from another Russian National Library manuscript. This is a 13th or 14th century manuscript. Again, I'll give you a flavor of the text in Arabic, and you'll immediately recognize the dialectal Egyptian nature of this manuscript. So this is talking about what's called truth revealed. Once Yeshu's real parentage is revealed, and what happens after that. Okay, so it says, فبعد أيام انسمع الخبر في البلد بأن مريم جوزة الحسيد or Miriam maybe جوزة الحسيد يوحنان in حبلة وقربت للولادة فولدت ولد وأسمته يشوع وهي المسكينة, and this is sort of the folksy part of it. So وهي المسكينة ما لها علم ما بتحسب إلا إنه من جوزها الحقاني إحنا في دال منعول يوسف بانديرا دائر بيحكي للناس. Okay, so I'm about to say it in English. You can understand that you see a lot of narrative intervention here. So the thing I just read, we're talking about the story of that cursed one, Yosef Pandera, who's going around telling people what happened. That's the father, the real father, the neighbor. So this is a mixed text with some formal Arabic and a lot of spoken Arabic. So overall, the Arabic is quite informal in what I just read. The sentences are constructed in a run-on way. This is not high literature at all. Simple conjunctions, wow, and. Everything is connected by an and. The verb forms use forms generally reserved for speaking and not for writing. So for example, this one, ma btahsab, she didn't realize. So in written form, it would be la tahsibu. So this is spoken Arabic. And also something like this, where the narrator is putting in this interjection. You know, we're talking about this cursed guy, Del Man'ul. Man'ul, by the way, is an inversion. It would be Mal'un in Arabic. So really, really colloquial speech. So that is from relatively early on, and this manuscript is from the 13th or 14th century, pretty early for Judeo-Arabic manuscripts. This text is copied and transmitted in a very dialectal Arabic. So this is unexpected, even for Judeo-Arabic, in a manuscript of this age. So remember, Judeo-Arabic has this higher register that most manuscripts from this period were still written in. The register of manuscripts like this and others that I found suggests that this text was already conceived of and functioned as a popular narrative from this relatively early period. Now, the language of the manuscript the way the Arabic is written, is not the only suggestion that Toledot Yeshu was serving a popular function. Popular literature, you could call it folk literature. The literary context of the way it circulated also is evidence of this. So far, the manuscripts that I showed are bits and pieces. You've noticed they're quite fragmentary. You saw our friend way back, ripped pieces of paper. They're bits and pieces of the plot. I can't tell how these manuscripts circulated. I just have bits and pieces, 1 page, 2 pages sometimes. But later manuscripts from the 18th century and on do preserve literary context. And who are the neighbors of this polemical narrative, of this story of Toledot Yeshu? So Toledot Yeshu is grouped with other tales, parodies, pseudo-histories, travel narratives, expanded scripture, and even medieval romances. So these are some of the neighbors of Toledot Yeshu in these 18th century works, 19th century also. So these are all well-known representatives of folk literature, of stories. Okay, even things you might find in 1001 Nights. So Toledot Yeshu is grouped with these other tales, and I found these contexts throughout the Jewish communities of the Near East and the Mediterranean. I found them in Judeo Arabic, I found them in Hebrew, Judeo Persian, and even in Ladino. Dozens of codices that included Toledot Yeshu with all of this sort of literature of entertainment, this popular literature. That is, this is the context in which Toledot Yeshu was transmitted in the later Near East. So the informal linguistic style of these manuscripts beginning around the 13th century, combined with the codicological evidence of later manuscripts, suggests that Toledot Yeshu had become a type of popular literature for the Jews of the Near East. Once we understand that Toledot Yeshu circulated in this type of collection of entertaining popular literature, the motivation to copy and transmit it is much clearer. So this is the answer to the question I proposed in the beginning of my talk. Why ever was this anti-Christian polemical work, an aggressive, possibly humorous parody on the life of Jesus, so popular among Arabic-speaking Jews? So as we've seen, we have to answer it in 2 ways. It certainly functioned as a work of polemic in the period of late antiquity and the early Islamic period. And this was a reason for its early literary development and its circulation. It fulfilled a polemical need. It gave Jews their own Jesus story that could effectively respond to other Arabic Jesus stories around them. However, I propose that by the time Toledot Yeshu had circulated in Jewish communities in the Near East for several centuries, and certainly by the 13th century, Mamluk period, the polemical aspects of the narrative become less important for the community, and the text begins to make its way into groupings of popular literature that are forming during this time. It takes on new relevance within these groupings, and thus, even during the Mamluk and Ottoman period, when polemical needs, and especially polemic against Christians, are no longer central, it continues to circulate prolifically. Now I want to sum up and take us a bit further. So in closing, I want to say a few words about the implication of these findings for the study of Toledot Yeshu and for current research on medieval Judeo-Arabic literature, as well as for the study of Jewish-Christian polemic. So regarding Toledot Yeshu, it's clear that Judeo-Arabic manuscripts are a crucial addition to the field. It's not just that an entire audience of some 1,500 years was ignored in earlier research, or just that the Judeo-Arabic manuscripts survive from a period that predates the earliest European manuscripts in Hebrew by as much as 600 years. It's that they can, as I've shown you, contribute to current discussions regarding the creation of the text. They can also teach us about the transmission of the text between East and West, between the Jews in the Arabic-speaking world and Jews in Europe. And I haven't had time to discuss that today. It also raises questions for Toledot Yeshu in Europe. So copies of Toledot Yeshu that circulated in Europe, those 70 to 80 that I mentioned, are without exception in high register Hebrew, a Hebrew that probably not everybody could understand. Given what we see in Judeo-Arabic, we should ask, how was this literature mediated to Jewish communities in Europe? Was it really read aloud to them in high register Hebrew? Or should we suggest that it was being sort of translated orally into the vernaculars, including Yiddish? And by the way, there are about 30, in that 70 and 80 that I mentioned, there's about 30 manuscripts of Toledot Yeshu in Yiddish, which are just beginning to be researched. So furthermore, the study of Toledot Yeshu contributes to the study of a currently developing field, Judeo Arabic popular literature. Now, the field of Jewish popular literature in Hebrew is very well developed. Folktales in Hebrew, there's been a lot of study about them. This is not the case for Judeo Arabic. And according to what I found and what I've shown you, Toledot Yeshu might be viewed as part of a developing collection of Jewish popular literature in Judeo Arabic, which is attested in what researchers call the Late Genizah period, that is post-13th century. The Late Genizah period is a richly documented period that has not received the attention that was gained by the classical Genizah period prior to the 13th century. And researchers have only recently begun to examine popular literature. So we're talking about non-elite literature, sometimes paraliturgical, things that might be read on Purim, Qissat Esther, the story of Esther, Qissat Hannah, the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, read on the 9th of Av, Qissat Yusuf, the story of Joseph, that's read on Passover. Sometimes they adopted non-Jewish literature, so stories that we might recognize from Alf Layla wa Layla, from 1001 Nights, that are known to be of Muslim origin, all sorts of things, and research is just beginning on these. So my research on manuscript copies of Toledot Yeshu suggests that the formation of a more or less fixed body of works that were included in these collections. So I'm very wary about using the word canon, but we can talk about a proto-canon being formed of popular literature, what Jews were reading for fun in Judeo-Arabic. And as I showed you, these collections are attested from east to west. So I found them all the way out in Persia, Judeo-Persian attestation, all the way to manuscripts from the Maghreb, from all the way out west to Morocco. And I found them in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. I will note also in parentheses that the field of popular literature in Arabic, so not just Judeo-Arabic, but Arabic in general, in the Mamluk and Ottoman period is a field that is just beginning to grow. It's being increasingly recognized as central, that you don't have to deal with just elite literature. And I myself have done my work and do my work in elite literature, but non-elite literature, what your average person was reading, is also quite important. So this field is increasingly being recognized as central by scholars of Arabic literature, and Toledot Yeshu has a lot to contribute to this field as well. It predates most other Arabic texts as written by Muslims, and it had a great longevity. So it's an important contribution to the growing field of Arabic popular literature in general. Finally, Toledot Yeshu has important implications for the wider field of Jewish-Christian polemic. So while earlier research on Toledot Yeshu has nearly entirely focused on Toledot Yeshu in the European sphere, that of the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Here again, we see that the roots of Jewish-Christian polemic in Europe should be sought in the Near East. Europe was not the place where Jews and Christians first met. That happened in the Near East. And here I can note the research of Daniel Lasker, Sarah Strunzer, Chava Lazarus-Yaffe. So specific arguments relating to Jewish-Christian polemics, specific arguments Jews were using in their works, were certainly born in the Near East, and this has been shown. And now we have a composition which was formerly presumed to be a European creation, which should be traced, I believe in both of its versions, to Near Eastern Jewish communities. The case of Toledot Yeshu, then, is that of a composition created and developed in the East in a very specific Aramaic and Arabic-speaking milieu, which at some point, likely with ebbs and flows, made its way to Europe, taking on new life in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and in Western European languages, and then, I believe, was transported back to the Near East again, in Hebrew, to Arabic-speaking Jewish communities. But that is another lecture. Thank you very much.